name's Adam Spring, and this is a remotely interested video. And this video was filmed as part of the VCF Southeast 5.0 build-up, shall we say. So the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast was being held in Atlanta in April 2017, and I got a few friends together and we were doing a panel for Viva Amiga, which was a film all about the Amiga computer. And in the build-up to that, I've had a few people talk along the way, like Joe Decuir, who was one of the first hardware engineers to work on and conceptualize the Amiga. I also had David Pleasance, former managing director of Commodore UK, and a couple of friends, Dan and Ravi from the Retro Hour, talk about the UK Amiga scene because it was so massive there. And somebody else that I wanted, and have been very fortunate to get, is Kim Justice. So in this video, Kim and I, we talk about a lot of things retro. Coincidentally, just before I made this video, Kim did what I consider her best work. She did a video on retro, which really shows off her skills and her chops, shall we say, as not just a filmmaker, as not just a communicator, but someone that is a student of the game, pun intended. She's somebody that looks at every facet of the subject she is exploring. In this case, it's retro computing, it's retro video gaming, it's computational media, or as much as I hate the term, digital humanities, if you want to basically look at it from an academic slant. And one of the things I think she is fantastic at is being able to combine rhetoric with logic. And I don't have enough good things to say about what Kim is doing. I just think if you haven't checked out any of her stuff, there are going to be links to certain videos like the one that she did on retro, Sega 95, which shows her off as a very competent historian, as well as, because I've mentioned it in other videos, the Games Master, Bad Influence, and some of the other UK magazine stroke media output that shows what was going on in that scene throughout the 90s in terms of retro computing and video gaming. Anyway, that's enough from me for now. There will be other video links that have been included in other videos below this one as well. Please do go and check it out. And I will leave it over to Kim. So Kim, based on your last wonderful video on retro, I was wondering if I could get your perspective on retro and how it's evolved over the years.
Okay. Well, for me, retro in the gaming world seems to have a different meaning there than it has in most other places, in places like fashion and sort of in design in general, in art, say. Retro there usually seems to consist of taking a work that takes elements from the past, from the kind of recent past, and then extrapolating that into something that's entirely new. Whereas kind of retro has kind of, I guess, a more simpler meaning in the world of gaming, in that it just means, you know, playing games and so on that are old, or playing on old systems when there's newer available. I'm not sure if that's something that you would agree with, but
absolutely, yeah.
And so kind of retro's always had that kind of simpler meaning. So we only ever really define like what is retro by the sort of the usual, I suppose, like definitions, like, well, it's something that happened about 20 years ago, sort of like PS2 is probably a couple of years away from being retro still in some people's eyes. And so I kind of wanted to go into like the term with the video that I did, and like perhaps like the similarities that it has in the retro gaming world, or the differences between that and say something like nostalgia, and why kind of a lot of us, like myself included, still do like nostalgic things. Like, say, I mean, why do we, when there's sort of cycle accurate emulators, say, available on PC, why still do some of us choose to spend 3 to 5 minutes loading up a ZX Spectrum game? You know, how important is that to the experience? And I also wanted to have a look at that in the context of all like modern games that come out that have a retro bent. Because I mean, there's some games that come out that have a more retro feel. They kind of use like retro music, whether it's synthwave, vaporwave, things like that, and follow kind of 80s, 90s trends. And yet there's also some games that kind of go completely authentic, as in they look like something that you would see on a NES or a Commodore 64, or something like that, they look, and in some cases even, especially in the case of homebrew that comes out, they are on a NES or a C64 or a Spectrum. So I kind of wanted to look into that kind of authenticity and feel. It seems to me at the moment we're kind of in a stage where people want to be authentic as much as possible. That's what I'm kind of noticing with a lot of the games that have been coming out recently. Things like Ukulele, which, I mean, although the graphics are very high fidelity, is so like a late 90s Nintendo 64 Banjo-Kazooie style platformer, or Thimbleweed Park. I mean, a lot of that is perhaps due to a lot of the original designers are working on that sort of thing. But you also get a lot of people from like the new school who are coming up who are also doing the same thing. I mean, interactive like FMV sort of games are something that's coming back. Kind of going to like news today that we're going to have I think it's a remake of Night Trap. Is coming out of all games.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, really. Night Trap is coming back.
Oh, very cool.
FMV games, interactive movies are coming back in. I mean, I think it's perhaps also something that goes back to if you ever played Her Story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of in the interactive movie formula, and got a good reception. So I think people are kind of slowly bringing that creeping back in.
Yeah.
There's all these little things that come up. It's becoming more wider. I think a few years ago, especially with like retro-styled games, it kind of used to be just like NES-style games, platformers, stuff with chip tunes. But now it's kind of expanding to take on a wider span of like gaming's history.
Yeah. I mean, do you think we've kind of, we've moved on, slightly looking at this from a generational point of view, where we're at the moment, we've now kind of hit the Nintendo 64 generation, so to speak. It's kind of, that's the phase where we're at now. Do you think that's what's going on?
Yes, I think we are. We are definitely hitting that stage where a lot of the people who are now making games grew up with N64, grew up with PlayStation in particular as well. So I think we'll perhaps see a lot more games that will touch on things like that, whether they'll touch on those 3D platformers, or we might see a lot more games with, say, pre-rendered backgrounds. Yeah. Again, perhaps that kind of makes me think of Torment, Tides of Numenera, which has that sort of pre-rendered RPG look, or even like the newer Resident Evil games that are going back to the old formulas.
Yeah. And how much of this would you attribute to, because if you look at a lot of the stuff that we were watching back in the day, like Games Master, like Bad Influence, Bytes or Bits, anything, all of that sort of stuff, how much do you think can this be attributed to the fact that we're always online now? We're connected across the world, like YouTube and eBay have just created an entire economy around this stuff. Do you think there is an element to that, or?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of people, especially it's kind of the way I kind of think of it with us being always online. In some ways, it's easier for us to have access to everything, and we can educate ourselves so easily on the entire history of gaming. It's so easy to play all different games from the past and present in a way that it wasn't back in the 90s. Like in the 90s, unless you perhaps read an article in a magazine or something, it'd be difficult to become aware of the spectrum. But it's also harder in a way because a lot of the stuff that we have now is very directed and playlisted and curated for us by sort of algorithms and so on. I mean, if you take something like Spotify, into example, it's it creates a playlist and allows you to kind of discover stuff based on the stuff that you already listen to. So it's sort of like it's bringing you into new stuff, but it's stuff that's not completely out of your sort of what your tastes are. So, and with that being so easy, it can be kind of easy for people to just kind of go in flat motion. I mean, you see it with Spotify, with YouTube recommendations, Netflix recommendations. The way that the online world works is becoming so complex that, a lot of people don't feel the need to, leave that area because they're not really given those options. They're not easy to find. Yeah. If kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and in terms of the current retro scene in the UK, what would you say are the big events that are going on? Because this will obviously be watched by audiences in the US and other places as well.
Well, as far as big events goes on, I mean, there is a big wave now of trying to get our old computers sort of back in. A lot of Spectrum nostalgia these days. I mean, obviously there's been the Vega Plus, which I suppose some people might wear, has had a bit of a rocky road. But Spectrum Next is something that's recently come out with sort of a Spectrum that promises kind of more memory, more power for people. It's kind of focused more towards people who want to actually work on a Spectrum still and want to do more than just play the old games on it. Although that is obviously a big part of its functionality and appeal. So it's not just kind of bringing the computers back in, but also bringing the computers back in a way that still makes them relevant, I suppose. And you're also seeing, I guess, games like Hyper Sentinel with those aesthetics of like an old Spectrum C64 computer game updated for a modern generation. So I am sensing that perhaps at some point it will move perhaps more towards something like that coming out with an Amiga slant. I mean, we're seeing things like The Vampire come out for the Amiga now, which, again, I mean, because there is still a big base out there that's of Amiga enthusiasts who want to use their computer and keep their computer relevant so that they can still, do all the stuff online and still code with it. And so, I mean, it still has a market, and it seems to grow bigger over time because as people are more interested in it.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, recently, you did a very good article in Retro Gamer on the Amiga 500, I believe, as well, didn't you? So
yes.
Yeah. So in terms of the Amiga, then, obviously, refining this down to the Viva Amiga panel, which part of this video was done for. What are your big memories of the Amiga?
Well, I came into the Amiga actually very late, as far as the timeline of the console goes. I didn't actually get an Amiga until December 1994, and it was an A1200. By which time, I mean, that's after Commodore itself went bust, or American Commodore. I mean, Commodore UK was still around at that point, I think. My memories of it was, even though it was quite late on, there was so much software to discover. It's still kind of my first proper experience with a sort of, I guess, a graphical computer like that. I mean, I had Spectrum before, but my kind of PC experience was only in schools, in education. Windows 3.1 and all that sort of thing. So yes, there's a lot of stuff. I will remember. I mean, by that time the sort of pirating, copying scene was not really a thing. But I do remember lots of like old Amiga users. Because when I used to go out with my dad on sort of sales trips and that, a lot of the people that my dad was working with would give me their old copies of pirated discs. I'd say, oh, you like Amiga, do you? Oh, here you go. Have this box full of floppy disks.
Wow.
So yeah, it's quite fun. And I mean, and the magazines were still around. It had the magazines. I used to be a big reader of Amiga Format, Amiga Power, even Amiga Action, I have to say. I mean, and yeah, so I mean, they still had a fan base, and there's still a couple of good games left to come out. But I mean, I stuck with the Amiga despite the late stage for quite a long time. I mean, I think it's probably around 1998 when sort of finally I sort of moved away from it, because all the magazines were pretty much gone by then, and there was very little left for sort of average user like me.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was a very special time. There's because I'd mostly been playing on consoles, the Amiga was my introduction to a lot of sort of games like Syndicate, like more strategic games, or world-building games like Theme Park, that I didn't really have when I was just playing on Mega Drive or SNES.
Yeah, and what do you think? Because before we did this video, I had Dan Ravi and David Pleasance on. What do you think the lasting legacy of the Amiga in Europe in general actually is?
Well, I think it is one of the most famous sort of non-PC computers there is. I mean, it was for a time, I think, especially here in the UK, from about 1989 to about 1993, for a 4-year period, it was one of the strongest games machines out there. Like both, and for a time that would be both console and computer. It's certainly it's a far cry from how it was in America, from all that I've read, where kind of as a commercial entity anyway, it was the Amiga probably went off in about 1990, 91 or so, as an actual commercial thing. Not that they weren't enthusiasts, but commercially anyway. And obviously, I mean, I've read a lot about people from American Commodore saying that they looked at like UK and Germany, like the places where Commodore in particular was massive, and think, geez, they kind of wish they had that in America, had that sort of the marketing power that it had. I mean, because especially, I mean, one of the things that David Pleasance, you just mentioned, used to do, like the bundles that he did and organised things like the Batman pack and Screen Gems and all that, and Cartoon Classics, really, in particular, helped the Amiga to establish itself over here and make it. I mean, because I think the thing that kind of Commodore, especially in the UK, got about the Amiga was how good a games playing machine it was.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if American Commodore really ever got that about the Amiga.
Yeah.
And in the end, I mean, that was one of the things going to the Spectrum, I suppose, that contributed to the long life of the Spectrum over here. I mean, it should have probably died in 1986 when Sinclair was basically going bust. But then when Amstrad got it, they figured, well, it's a good games playing machine. And they sold it based on that, and it lasted another 5 years.
Yeah. So it's not just about the technology; it's also about the business channels and distribution as well. Then.
Yeah, and actually, just getting what the computer's really good at, and what it's best to be sold at. And I think that Commodore UK and the Commodore companies, the sub companies in Europe, really got that.
So before we go, I am going to ask you two things. One is what your top 5 games of all time are, which you can answer in a minute. And two, I'd like to start with, what you think about, old technology being able to tell us something about, the present and the future. In this case, old computers.
Right, okay. As far as old technology telling us, I mean, obviously the thing that has changed with computers as time's gone on is the accessibility of them. I mean, back in the sort of early 80s when Commodore and Apple were, doing all their stuff, or not Apple are still doing their stuff, but they always kind of said to people that, you need a computer in your life. It's going to be the most important thing. You can do your shopping list on it. You can do your taxes. You can organise your house using the computer even. And in a way, that was kind of jumping the gun a little bit, because then a lot of people ended up getting computers, especially adults, and because they didn't necessarily the coding knowledge at all, because no one was really teaching them how to actually do that. They kind of struggled, and then people kind of thought, well, why should I do my taxes and so on a computer when I could just do them on paper as I've always done? And obviously over time that's changed, but I mean, I think that the sort of angle to approach from is, of course, the younger generation that's always had computers, and a lot of people do have those computers just to play games on. But I don't think it's ever changed that there's always going to be people who are interested in the possibilities of coding and creating with computers and trying that out for themselves. I mean, that's something that, to me, I don't think is ever going to go away. Again, kind of going back to discussion we had of all people always being online. Now the resources for people to learn how to do that, especially the younger generation, are more open than ever. You can go to GitHub or GitHub or however you pronounce it, and you find people who'll teach you how to code, or you'll be able to find a good resource on there. So that's not really changing. And so yes, there's some things that have become different over time, and some things that have always stayed the same and always will. As far as my top 5 favourite games of all time goes, that's such a tough one. Number one will still always be Final Fantasy VII. That was a game that changed everything and really kind of, I suppose, really emphasised the possibilities of what games could do. What else? Metal Gear Solid, one of them would be up there for sure. Usually number 2. I think it's such a out there game. Super Metroid would have to be on there, I think. Bayonetta. I was kind of playing the PC remake of it, or remaster of it recently, and just reminded us how much I loved that game. And probably then also I'd have to put something like Sensi on there, Sensible World of Soccer, as a game that I played for so many hours, and just because I love sports games, and I feel that it's kind of important to have something like that on the list. Yeah. So I guess for the minutes, that would be my top 5. If you ask me this 10 minutes later, it'll probably change completely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Adam, and I look forward to perhaps speaking again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.